Hi there. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ludmila. Thank you, everyone who has presented and those yet to go. I do know that my presentation is 11 minutes 30, so I know I'm forfeiting a bit of time for question, but I want to start right away. I am, however, not seeing my share screen button enough.
Well, it should be on the bottom and in the middle, the green one.
Yes, got it. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Something.
Full screen. Yeah.
Well, yeah, yes, we can see it. All good.
All right. As a child, my favorite narrative trope was, surprisingly for a fashion historian, not the one in which dress changes the life of the protagonist, nor the one with the invisible robes. Instead, my imagination was captured by the stories in which wishes were granted and then thoughtlessly made, resulting in unexpected and unfortunate occurrences. Then the maker of wishes recants, causing the world to return to the way things were and presumably should always have been. Our recent global paradigm, however, might do well to produce other sorts of moralizing tales. Tales in which things change and cannot be reverted, and in which catastrophe can be undressed as a blessing in disguise. It might go something like this. At the end of the second decade of the 21st century, a girl was tired and weary from having accomplished all the right things. She had traveled to too many places, too many times for too many reasons. She had stylish clothes to pack in stylish suitcases and so many travel photos to post on Instagram. And she learned about and talked about many things of great importance to the people who already believed such things were of great importance. But she felt she had unfinished business. And so, during one of those moments between lifting the seat back and feeling the landing gear drop, she asked the universe for two things. At 19,000 feet, she was sure that these things would be the most efficient routes to contentment and virtue. This coming year, she said, I want to not go anywhere by plane, and I want to spend as much time as possible alone. What would she do with this limited space and invisible time? She would finish things she started. She would embrace rituals. She would buy less, choose well, make it less, spark joy, dance like no one was watching, eat, pray, love, and finally get around to obeying that eternal command, know thyself. She took it very seriously, but the universe, it seemed, took it way too seriously. And so months later, while avoiding the Prime Minister's weekly update by watching old episodes of The Great Big Sewing Bee, she looked into the eyes of Boris the spider, her faithful pincushion, and asked him, as self-involved fairy tale heroines always do, can it all be my fault? Of course, it was not her wishes that had canceled the Odysseys, closed the gates of TK Maxx, or stopped lovers from knowing each other's touch. Still, she couldn't help feeling guilty that she got what she wished for, and that despite the suffering of so many people in so many kingdoms, she didn't want to wish that everything would go back the way it was. The guilt was more severe than the kind she felt after drinking pink wine and spending too much money on shoes that hurt her feet. It was more like a terrible secret that you can't even tell your best friend who also drinks pink wine and borrows your shoes, even though they hurt her feet. But the feeling didn't stop her from doing ballet every morning or painting her study a delicious shade of plum. It didn't stop her from archiving her collections, reading about the ancient monuments, or building a digital museum of her own work. It didn't stop her from watching every episode of The X-Files or talking to her brother on the phone more frequently. But most of all, it didn't prevent her from sewing. She reluctantly agreed to take part in a 12-step program for fabulous and frustrated artists, and it required her to do something she didn't like to do at all, and to do it early in the morning. Because the rules say you have to write 3 pages a day before even eating a soft-boiled egg, she dusted off a journal that had literally been shelved while she spent 4 years making a nebulous contribution to knowledge. So even on the rare days when she didn't thread a needle, she wrote down her just so stories. Tales of textiles, patterns, garments, and people that all had something to do with sewing at home and everything to do with the enigmas of existence itself. Sewing wasn't really new to her, and it had never been her hobby. And oh, how she abhorred this word. It meant that one was an amateur, that an activity was a pastime, because one was not dedicated or skilled enough to fashion it into a vocation. Sewing had been a keystone of her former profession when she was a sorceress of style for the stage. She had become adept at imitating the skills of Ariadne, but she made things in haste and hurry, always speeding towards opening night and bringing down the curtain on things to add to her portfolio. The process, however, facilitated the accumulation of a treasure trove of textiles for some day. Some of them she carried across the sea and back and are still awaiting the scissors blade. But all these projects in waiting caused her to accumulate distress as well. When would she ever have time to take the advice Isaac Mizrahi had given her? Sew and sew and sew until everything in your wardrobe is something you made yourself. She did try. She had made dresses to wear to visit the ancient sites. She had made the wedding clothes. She had made new party frocks from old patterns and draperies, but she made them all while feeling the same hourglass sands that she had while trying to make 12 corsets in 10 hours for the mystery of Edwin Drood. Because these garments usually didn't quite fit because they weren't quite finished, she had banished them from her wardrobe. She relegated them to charity shops or practiced alchemy at the dress agency to transform them into well-made, well-fitting clothes bearing the names of those who know how to properly insert boning or cut a blouse on the bias. There were, however, some things by her own hand that remained in the service of the body. Many of these, she realized with the help of her journal, were made from fabrics that came to her on journeys to wondrous places or while she was wrapped up in life-altering experiences when clothes didn't even matter. And they had been imagined, cut out, pinned together, and made flesh during times when what she needed most was not the thing to wear, but something to do to trick her mind into doing the work of rest. For a time, she was a businesswoman responsible for selling designs from back in the day as muses to new designs that would be made for the masses with the fewest seams possible. To show how much better things had been before plastic zippers were invented, she took to exclusively wearing clothes older than her own mother. But she had been born very, very short, and she had grown very wide, so she couldn't fit into the clothes marked CC 41. So many hems were shortened and waistbands enlarged, and she found herself mostly secretly sewing, mostly as a way to fit in. While she tried to figure out if she was still an artist and to overcome the fear of cold calls, she also learned a lot about dress history, and that the word cabbage used to refer to pieces of fabric pilfered by workers from their employers. This is when she started a salad of old cottons and even tried to toss these up with remnants that had come from Ghana or been discovered on Etsy by pairing the word vintage with Venice, Egypt, or merely novelty. But she was usually too busy or too nervous to pin any paper shapes to them, and she took the fact that according to Vogue patterns, her waist was a size 14 and her hips were a 20 and a half as a sign that she should leave sewing to the experts and possibly eat more cabbage. While her sewing project stagnated in an old yellow trunk that she used as a step stool, she worked in a shop where she sometimes had to darn moth holes or sew on buttons. And later she worked in a museum where she knelt down in reverence to the people who could sew well enough to reanimate the dead and to reanimate dead stock and shattered silk. She went back to school then to study fashion victims, and she imagined that would leave her little time for hobbies, even ones that related to clothes that don't suit the wearer. She was correct. But before reading 300 books and reviving another dead hobby that involved cutting up books, she cleared out her cupboards and cut up old clothes and rotting cabbages into squares that she hoped would someday be a patchwork quilt to rival the Harlequin Suit. She finished this blanket just 1 week ago, so it took her longer than her thesis to complete. In the process, Harlequin himself had become a spirit archetype, because his suit was like all the things that one wanted to wear and perform and be all at once, but was really just a collection of rags that only made sense when they were put together in the right order. Figuring this out took up so much space and conjured up so many questions that she ended up unpicking the seams that had held her home together. And she wondered if there was any wisdom in the stories about new clothes signaling the start of a new life. She briefly turned her flat into a sweatshop where salty water fell in rivulets on a series of new blouses made from the most cheerful fabrics in her oubliette. Months later, in the dead of winter, she had transferred the fruits of her intellect to be squeezed by experts in the field. She thought she deserved a holiday, or at least a hobby day or two. So she became nocturnal, a spider with all 8 eyes wide, some choosing materials, some matching seams, some winding bobbins, some watching all 7 seasons of Game of Thrones. But by the time the White Walkers came in full force, she should have been ready to step out in some new armor, but mostly she just wore the dressing gown she had trimmed with antique broderie anglaise. And she admired how well all the other garments looked on their hangers, even though they didn't quite fit and they weren't quite finished. The pointed center seam on a silk velvet waistband lined with satin damask had temporarily defeated her, but she did later finish the dress at the beginning of lockdown to serve as a record of her progress. When summer came, she could have worn those wonky garments with a wreath of laurel leaves, but she had a new job in a place where a Harlequin suit might be recognized as a sign of poverty it originally was. So she refrained from a back-to-school wardrobe. It was, however, almost time to commemorate the birth of a special friend with a gift that alluded to days and nights together. A chance encounter with a 1970s sewing pattern in a friend's attic, the sale at the Haberdashers of Liberty's, and her desire to practice flat-felled seams serendipitously coincided, resulting in a set of cool pajamas in crisp tattered lawn. In the process, she indulged in the purchase of some other remnants that later became instrumental in the composition of a nostalgic blouse for herself and a cowboy shirt for her partner in crime, made in the strange days when everyone had to decide who was or was not part of their household. These days are still upon us and the time for the tale is short, so you will have to rely on the illustrations if you are curious to see what else she has made while keeping 2 meters away from almost everyone except her dog, Mr. Punch, who she has never sewed any clothing for, by the way. During these hours, accompanied by everyone at Downton Abbey, she has often reflected, while struggling to thread a needle without wearing her glasses, about how her skills have strengthened while her eyesight has weakened. She has hardly any fabric left, and none of her patterns are uncut. There are many unfinished projects, but only because the post is not arriving in North London very often. Be assured the parcels will arrive and the garments will be completed, and their stories too will be added to the journal. And if she is your friend, colleague, or tutor, you will see the top half of these ensembles through a small screen very, very soon. Things are in fact different, even if you can't see them on Zoom or Teams or Blackboard. She always reads the pattern instructions and chooses fabrics of the appropriate weight. She has learned to sew a buttonhole on the machine. She measures, fits, and bastes, and stops when she is tired or there is not enough sunlight. She can sew a hand-rolled hem, and she descales her iron regularly. She is still afraid of invisible zippers and worries that a rotary cutter mishap is in her future, but is glad challenges are still on the horizon, and also there are a few episodes left of the Great British Sewing Bee. Sometimes she sees experts she knew in real life through that newfangled iPlayer, and she feels like she knows the contestants too, because everyone who sews has good days and bad days, and struggles to make it as good as they imagined, or fails sometimes when they take a creative risk involving silk charmeuse or sequin trim. And as she pasted new swatches in her journal before bed last night, she gave thanks to EasyJet for refunding her flights, to the other fashion experts who were also sharing their perfect pockets and maternity dresses made from Laura Ashley patterns, to her husband for not mentioning how many times he has stepped on pins on the kitchen floor, and she gave thanks to sewing itself for having been an activity that requires her to continually adjust the tension between public and private, between career-oriented goals and mastery-oriented goals, between work and play, self and others, home and away, and between living the life and telling the tale. Someday soon, you might see her at an airport waiting to hug a loved one to whom she's been intangible. She might be wearing an emblem of her mastery that is also the residue of this time spent alone in a space that was for time the whole knowable universe. At that moment, perfectly pressed darts on a coat made from vintage Heels bar cloth will fade into the background. Because after all, it didn't matter whether sewing was a hobby or a vocation. It was a means of putting together a patchwork of experience that brings her ever more in touch with things she'd wished for that she'd had all along. And since things were not going back to the way they were, she's glad she's at least made some alterations to her attitude that will hopefully equip her for the unknown ever after. And she's planning her next tattoo, which is fortunately one of her partner's hobbies. Thank you.
Jenna, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation and the narration itself. Yeah, great. So comments, questions? Yeah, Lainey loved the third person narrative and the evidence of your incredibly busy hands. Wonderful journals. Amazing. Wow, that was great. So yeah, I loved your own version of the fairy tale from Alison Matthews David, who is already with us from Canada, Toronto. Any other questions or comments? Questions? Yes, if you would. Jenna, will you take this practice with you post-lockdown?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thanks for the comments, everyone. Well, yeah, I think that this is the part of this that is the both the intellectual part and also the what is the promise one makes themselves to carry on. So certainly the different relationship to time makes these things possible. And yes, I think if I have an anxiety now, other than the post arriving, that anxiety is about will I be able to make this time to do this? And obviously a lot of the time I'm spending sewing is time when I would normally be socializing, and I want to do that immensely. And I have actually been out in the park with friends at social distance and come home and sewed. So I think there's something here about the more you do something when it actually becomes a habit. And this has been immensely made possible by doing the artist's way, which some people might be familiar with, and I've been doing it with a group. And also to a degree using a dieting app called Zoom that works with psychology about how to form habits. So I've actually been putting that intelligence towards my sewing practice.
Jenna, there is a question from somebody who's hidden behind Huggy's face. How long have you been keeping your
How long have I been keeping
diary? Yeah.
The book itself, I purchased and started in 2010. So right after I finished my MA, and it was at a time when I had first ever seen. Well, I would been, doing a curation degree, looking back at swatch books in museum collections, and also examples of usually sampler books or sampler crochet and embroidery diaries. And because collage was always a part of my artistic practice, it seemed like a natural thing to do. So I think there was the book has been made in like a palimpsest, many layers of sticking things in and then writing down, in 2013, oh, I think I might make this. And then going back to it. But only in lockdown have I made it a ritual to write in it every day.
Thank you. Jenna, yes, everybody just says so. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation and for this, for sharing this.